November 8, 1942. Outside Algiers, French North Africa. 0347 hours. General Major Walter Nering stood in the pre-dawn darkness, studying the horizon through his binoculars as his armored reconnaissance units reported contact with American forces for the first time. The veteran Panzer commander, who had led mechanized units across Poland, France, and Russia, expected to face the Americans with the same superiority German forces had demonstrated against every opponent since 1939. His intelligence briefings had described American equipment as inferior, soft vehicles unsuited for combat, inexperienced crews, and inadequate training. The first American vehicle he observed through his optics was something so absurd he initially dismissed it as a mistake. A tiny, open-topped automobile, barely larger than a motorcycle with sidecar, approached his forward positions at impossible speed across terrain that should have stopped it cold. The vehicle carried 4 soldiers and a machine gun. It had no armor, no doors, no roof. It looked like something farmers might use to check crops, not something any military would deploy in combat. Nering watched the vehicle, which his intelligence staff would identify as the American Jeep, navigate around obstacles, ford a stream, climb a steep embankment, and disappear into the hills before his units could react. Within minutes, German positions were under accurate artillery fire. The little vehicle had spotted his forces, radioed their positions, and vanished. His counter-battery fire hit empty desert. The Jeep was already gone. "This is their reconnaissance vehicle?" Nering asked his intelligence officer, incredulous. "This toy automobile?" "Jawohl, Herr General. American intelligence indicates they have produced over 100,000 of these vehicles. They call it General Purpose Vehicle, GP, which the Americans pronounce Jeep." Nering lowered his binoculars and smiled. The Americans had built 100,000 unarmored recreational vehicles and called it mobilization. The German army would destroy them with ease, the same way they had destroyed Polish cavalry, French tanks, and Soviet mechanized units. This war would be shorter than expected. What Nering didn't know, what German intelligence had completely failed to grasp, was that he had just observed the most significant military vehicle innovation since the tank. The Jeep would prove more strategically important than any armored fighting vehicle, more operationally flexible than any truck, and more tactically decisive than most weapon systems. It would traverse terrain German vehicles couldn't cross. It would operate in conditions that immobilized conventional military transport. It would serve in roles from reconnaissance to ambulance to artillery tractor to command vehicle to weapons platform. Most devastatingly, it would be produced in such numbers, 640,000 by war's end, that American forces would possess mobility German commanders couldn't counter. While German units walked, rode horses, or waited for scarce motorized transport, American forces drove. The Jeep didn't win the war through firepower or armor. It won through ubiquity, reliability, and the unprecedented mobility it provided to armies fighting across 6 continents. This is the story of how the world's simplest military vehicle became one of its most unstoppable, how a design so basic it could be built in 49 days outperformed vehicles Germany had spent years developing, and how German mockery turned to desperate respect as they discovered that sometimes the most sophisticated weapon is the one that just works, everywhere, always, regardless of conditions. The Jeep's origin story began in bureaucratic desperation rather than engineering brilliance. In June 1940, as France collapsed and Britain fought for survival, the U.S. Army faced an embarrassing reality. It possessed virtually no modern military equipment. The Army's motor pool consisted largely of civilian trucks unsuited for combat and obsolete vehicles from the First World War. The mechanization that had made the Wehrmacht unstoppable was completely absent from American forces. Major Robert G. Howe of the Army's infantry branch identified a specific gap. The Army needed a lightweight reconnaissance vehicle that could replace motorcycles and horses in forward observation roles. The vehicle needed to carry 3 soldiers plus a machine gun, traverse rough terrain, be air transportable, and cost less than $750. The specifications distributed to 135 American manufacturers on June 27, 1940, demanded something that didn't exist: a 1,300-pound four-wheel drive vehicle capable of operating anywhere. Most manufacturers ignored the request. The specifications were impossible. Building a four-wheel drive vehicle at 1,300 pounds violated basic automotive engineering principles. The transmission, transfer case, and drivetrain components alone would exceed the weight limit. Adding body, engine, suspension, and carrying capacity was physically impossible using conventional design. American Bantam Car Company, a struggling manufacturer in Butler, Pennsylvania, decided impossible specifications were better than bankruptcy. The company assigned Karl Probst, a freelance automotive engineer, to design the vehicle. Probst had 2 days to create preliminary drawings. He worked 18-hour days, discarding every automotive convention that added unnecessary weight. The result was something that looked more like a motorized wheelbarrow than an automobile. Probst's design eliminated everything non-essential. No doors, soldiers would climb over the sides. No top, weather protection added weight. Minimal body panels, a flat hood, and simple fenders were sufficient. The frame was welded steel channel instead of traditional construction. The suspension used the simplest possible design. The transmission was manual with minimal gearing. The engine was a small Continental 4-cylinder producing just 45 horsepower. The vehicle Bantam delivered to the Army on September 23, 1940, weighed 1,840 pounds, 540 pounds over specification. But it worked. The little vehicle could go places larger vehicles couldn't reach. It climbed 60% grades that stopped conventional trucks. It forded streams 18 inches deep. It turned in a 34-foot diameter circle. Most importantly, it was simple enough that any soldier could drive it, and mechanically basic enough that field repairs required minimal tools. The Army immediately requested bids for 1,500 vehicles from multiple manufacturers to ensure adequate supply. Willys Overland Motors and Ford Motor Company submitted competing designs. Willys produced a more powerful engine, the Go Devil 4-cylinder, generating 60 horsepower, that gave better performance while maintaining acceptable weight. Ford applied mass production expertise that reduced manufacturing costs. The Army, hedging against supply problems, contracted all 3 manufacturers. The final standardized design combined elements from all 3 companies. Willys provided the engine and basic design, which was designated the MB model. Ford built identical vehicles designated GPW. Government, 80-inch wheelbase, Willys design. Bantam, lacking Ford's production capacity, eventually ceased Jeep production and manufactured trailers instead. The consolidated design weighed 2,450 pounds empty, nearly double the original specification, but Army tests confirmed it could go anywhere soldiers needed to go. The production ramp-up demonstrated American industrial capacity that would shock Access observers. Willys retooled its Toledo, Ohio factory in early 1941, reaching initial production of 150 Jeeps per day. Ford's Rouge plant, the world's largest integrated factory, converted one assembly line to Jeep production and achieved 300 units per day. By late 1942, combined production exceeded 1,000 Jeeps daily. Total wartime production reached 363,000 Willys MB models and 277,000 Ford GPWs, 640,000 vehicles in just over 3 years. The per-unit cost dropped from $738.74 in 1941 to $648.53 by 1945, despite significant wartime inflation. This represented extraordinary efficiency, producing more complex vehicles at lower real cost as production volumes increased. The cost reduction came through manufacturing innovations. Stamped parts replaced machined components, welding replaced bolts where possible, and simplified assembly procedures reduced labor hours. A Jeep required approximately 16 man-hours to assemble, compared to 200-plus hours for conventional automobiles. The Jeep's mechanical simplicity was deliberate engineering philosophy. The Go Devil engine used L-head valve configuration, old-fashioned by 1940 standards, but extremely reliable and easy to repair. The four-cylinder design had minimal vibration issues. The cooling system was gravity-fed with minimal components to fail. The electrical system was 6-volt with uncomplicated wiring. The transmission was a simple 3-speed manual with a 2-speed transfer case for 4-wheel drive. Everything was designed for field maintenance by soldiers with basic mechanical knowledge. The suspension system exemplified this philosophy. The Jeep used semi-elliptic leaf springs front and rear, technology dating to horse-drawn wagons, but proven and reliable. The springs were deliberately soft, providing 8 inches of wheel travel that allowed the vehicle to articulate over obstacles. The long travel suspension meant the Jeep could keep 3 wheels on the ground while one wheel was lifted 18 inches above the others, critical capability for traversing rocks, logs, and broken terrain. The 4-wheel drive system was the vehicle's defining capability. Power from the engine went through the transmission to a 2-speed transfer case. In high range, the Jeep operated in rear-wheel drive for road use. Engaging the transfer case front axle lock sent power to all 4 wheels, providing traction in mud, sand, snow, and loose soil. Low range doubled the gear reduction, allowing the Jeep to climb extremely steep grades or pull heavy loads at walking speed. The system was mechanically simple. No electronics, no complex hydraulics, just reliable mechanical linkages. The payload capacity was officially rated at 800 pounds, but routinely exceeded in field use. A standard infantry squad of 8 soldiers, averaging 160 pounds each with equipment, could pile into a Jeep for short movements. The vehicle would be overloaded and uncomfortable, but it would move. Supply units routinely loaded Jeeps with 1,200 to 1,500 pounds of ammunition, rations, or equipment. The vehicle would labor under the load, but it would deliver. The fuel consumption averaged 16 to 20 miles per gallon depending on terrain and load, remarkably efficient for a 4-wheel drive vehicle. The 15-gallon fuel tank provided 240 to 300 miles range under normal conditions. In practice, combat operations consumed fuel faster due to constant idling, frequent stops and starts, and operation in 4-wheel drive. But even at 10 to 12 miles per gallon in combat conditions, the Jeep could operate for full day on single tank of fuel. The maintenance requirements were minimal compared to other military vehicles. The Army's technical manuals specified oil changes every 1,000 miles, spark plug cleaning every 5,000 miles, and valve adjustments every 10,000 miles. In combat, these intervals were often ignored. Jeeps operated for months without scheduled maintenance, receiving attention only when something actually broke. The robust design tolerated neglect that would have destroyed more sophisticated vehicles. The first combat test came during Operation Torch, the November 1942 Allied invasion of North Africa. American forces landed in Morocco and Algeria with thousands of Jeeps. the vehicles immediately encountered conditions that revealed both their capabilities and limitations. The desert terrain with soft sand, rocky wadis, and extreme temperatures tested every mechanical system. The Jeeps performed beyond expectations. They traversed sand dunes that stopped half-tracks. They negotiated rocky terrain that damaged conventional trucks. They operated in 120-degree heat that caused other vehicles to overheat. They ran on contaminated fuel that would have destroyed more precise engines. The simplicity that engineers had built into the design proved its value in conditions where sophisticated vehicles failed. German forces observing American mobility were initially dismissive. Oberst Rudolf Lang, commanding a Panzer Grenadier regiment, wrote in his after-action report from Tunisia, "The Americans rely on unarmored light vehicles for reconnaissance and command functions. These vehicles lack protection and are vulnerable to small arms fire. Their tactical doctrine appears to sacrifice security for speed. This reflects American inexperience. They will learn the cost of such amateurism." But Lang and other German commanders quickly discovered the tactical implications of American mobility. While German reconnaissance units rode motorcycles or horses, American scouts drove jeeps that covered 3 times the distance in the same time. While German officers walked or rode in staff cars restricted to roads, American commanders drove jeeps cross-country to observe situations personally. While German supply units waited for trucks to navigate primitive roads, American logistics troops drove jeeps loaded with critical supplies directly to forward units. The jeep's reconnaissance role proved particularly valuable. A 2-man jeep team, driver and observer with radio, could cover 100 miles of front line in a few hours, reporting enemy positions, obstacles, and terrain features. The vehicle's small size and agility allowed it to use terrain for concealment. Its speed allowed crews to escape if spotted. The radio allowed real-time reporting that gave commanders current battlefield intelligence. Lieutenant Colonel John Waters, commanding a tank battalion in Tunisia, described the Jeep's impact. "The Jeep changed how we conducted reconnaissance. Previously, we sent out patrols on foot or motorcycle that took hours to report information. Now we send jeeps that covered the same ground in minutes and radio reports immediately. We have real-time intelligence on enemy positions and movements. The Germans can't match this. Their reconnaissance is slower, their communications less reliable." The Jeep's role as artillery observation vehicle proved equally significant. Forward observers rode jeeps to positions where they could observe targets, radioed coordinates to gun batteries, and adjusted fire. The vehicle's mobility allowed observers to reposition quickly, making counter-battery fire difficult. The artillery liaison could ride with infantry commanders, providing immediate fire support anywhere on the battlefield. Captain James Burt, an artillery forward observer in North Africa, documented the Jeep's advantages. "I can position myself anywhere I can see the enemy, call for fire, adjust rounds onto target, and displace before German counter-battery fire arrives. In previous wars, forward observers were limited to prepared positions or moved on foot. Now I have mobility that makes me nearly impossible to suppress. The Germans hate it. They can't locate us before we move." The medical evacuation role emerged organically as soldiers discovered the Jeep could carry wounded faster than any other method. Litter racks were fabricated to hold stretchers across the hood and rear deck. A single Jeep could evacuate 4 litter patients or 6 walking wounded. The vehicle could reach aid stations in minutes across terrain that would take stretcher bearers hours to traverse. Thousands of soldiers owed their lives to Jeep ambulances that got them to surgical care before they bled out. Technical Sergeant James Howard, a combat medic with the 1st Infantry Division, described the impact. "Before Jeeps, we carried wounded on stretchers, exhausting work that took 4 men out of action and moved slowly. With Jeep ambulances, we evacuate wounded in minutes. The speed saves lives. Men who would have died from blood loss survive because we get them to doctors fast. The Jeep ambulance is as important as any medical advancement. The supply role became critical as American armies advanced rapidly across North Africa and later into Sicily and Italy. Traditional supply methods, trucks moving on roads to supply dumps, couldn't keep pace with fast-moving armored and motorized units. Jeeps, loaded with ammunition, rations, water, and fuel, could drive cross-country directly to units in contact. The last tactical mile, from supply dumps to frontline troops, was dominated by Jeeps. The command and control role proved equally valuable. Commanders could drive to critical points personally, observe situations firsthand, and make decisions based on direct observation rather than radio reports. Eisenhower famously visited frontline units regularly in his Jeep, inspecting positions and talking with soldiers. Patton drove his Jeep at reckless speeds to reach forward units, appearing at critical moments to influence battles personally. German commanders noted this with a mixture of admiration and frustration. General Major Fritz Bayerlein, commander of Panzer Lehr Division, wrote, "American commanders appear everywhere. They visit forward positions in their small vehicles, observe situations personally, and make rapid decisions. Our command structure is more formal. Commanders remain at headquarters, receiving reports and issuing orders. The American method is faster and more flexible. It also means their commanders understand battlefield realities better than reports convey." The Jeep's versatility spawned specialized variants. The most famous was the armed Jeep mounting a .50 caliber M2 Browning heavy machine gun. The weapon's pedestal mount allowed 360 degrees traverse and elevation from -10 to +65 degrees. The Jeep became a mobile fire support platform that could position quickly, deliver suppressive fire, and displace before receiving counter-fire. British Special Air Service units in North Africa armed Jeeps with multiple machine guns and used them for raids deep behind German lines. Major David Sterling, founder of the SAS, described the armed Jeep's impact. "We mount 3 .50 caliber machine guns on each Jeep, twin guns forward and single gun rear. The firepower is devastating against soft targets. We drive into enemy airfields at night, shoot up parked aircraft, and escape before organized response. A single SAS patrol with 3 Jeeps can destroy more aircraft in one raid than bomber missions costing millions." The 37mm anti-tank gun variant mounted a light cannon that provided infantry units with direct fire support against fortifications and light armor. The weapon's small size and light weight made it Jeep portable. Infantry battalions could position anti-tank guns anywhere a Jeep could drive, which meant almost anywhere. The mobility transformed anti-tank defense from static positions to mobile assets that could respond to threats. The communications variant carried radio equipment that created mobile command posts. These vehicles extended headquarters reach, allowing commanders to position themselves forward while maintaining communications with higher headquarters and subordinate units. The radio Jeep became essential for coordinating complex operations across dispersed forces. The cable-laying variant unwound telephone wire as it drove, establishing communications faster than soldiers could string wire manually. The wire team Jeep could establish 10 miles of field telephone line in an hour, work that previously required full day. The rapid communications establishment allowed headquarters to control dispersed forces more effectively. The winter of 1942-1943 in Tunisia tested the Jeep under conditions its designers hadn't anticipated. The North African winter brought cold rain, mud, and flooded wadis. German forces, expecting American vehicles to bog down, planned counteroffensives to exploit reduced mobility. They discovered that while American trucks struggled in mud, Jeeps kept moving. The four-wheel drive and high ground clearance allowed Jeeps to traverse mud that stopped everything else except tracked vehicles. Under-Officer Hans Schmidt, a German intelligence NCO captured in Tunisia, provided insights during interrogation. "We expected the American motorized units to become immobilized by mud, like Polish and French forces in 1939 and 1940. Instead, their small four-wheeled vehicles continued operating. They delivered supplies, evacuated wounded, and maintained communications when we expected their logistics to collapse. This American vehicle, the Jeep, appears to operate in any conditions." The Sicily invasion in July 1943 demonstrated the Jeep's amphibious capabilities, or rather, its ability to operate immediately after amphibious delivery. Jeeps were waterproofed with sealant and driven from landing craft into shallow water, climbing onto beaches under their own power. The vehicles were operational within minutes of landing, providing mobility before roads could be opened. The rapid mobility establishment allowed American forces to exploit landings faster than German forces could organize counterattacks. The Italian campaign from September 1943 onward tested the Jeep in mountainous terrain where roads were scarce and terrain was extreme. The vehicle proved capable of negotiating mountain trails designed for mule traffic. Supply units used Jeeps to reach mountain positions inaccessible to trucks. Artillery forward observers positioned themselves on mountain peaks, calling fire from positions German forces assumed were unreachable by vehicles. German defensive doctrine in Italy emphasized terrain obstacles, rivers, mountains, and restricted defiles to canalize Allied advances onto predictable routes where defenses could be concentrated. The Jeep's mobility reduced this advantage by allowing American forces to use terrain German planners considered impassable. Roads could be bypassed using cross-country mobility. Obstacles could be scouted quickly to find weak points. The tactical flexibility frustrated German defensive planning. Oberst August Zehender, operations officer for 14th Panzer Corps in Italy, described the problem in after-action reports. "American mobility allows them to appear on terrain we considered secure due to natural obstacles. Their light vehicles climb mountain trails, cross streams at unsuspected fording sites, and bypass demolitions by finding alternate routes. Our defensive planning must now assume Americans can reach any point accessible on foot. They have mechanized their infantry's mobility without sacrificing their ability to use difficult terrain." The Jeep's impact on logistics was perhaps its most significant contribution. The U.S. Army's logistics doctrine emphasized tonnage delivered. Getting supplies from ports to combat units required massive truck fleets moving along designated supply routes. This system worked for bulk transport, but struggled with the last tactical mile, getting specific supplies to specific units at critical moments. The Jeep solved this through tactical flexibility. A Jeep could carry 800 pounds of ammunition, rations, or fuel directly to a rifle company dug in on a mountainside. It could ford a stream to reach an isolated patrol. It could navigate through town rubble to deliver supplies to troops clearing buildings. The tactical supply delivery meant units received what they needed when they needed it, rather than waiting for scheduled supply convoys. The maintenance burden was remarkably light. U.S. Army maintenance companies reported that Jeeps required significantly less maintenance time than trucks or armored vehicles. The simple mechanics meant repairs were straightforward. The robust design meant failures were infrequent. The availability rate, percentage of vehicles operational at any time, exceeded 90% for Jeep units, compared to 70 to 80% for other vehicle types. Private First Class Robert Mitchell, a mechanic with the 3rd Armored Division, described the maintenance perspective. "We can fix a Jeep with basic tools in an hour. The engine is simple: 4 cylinders, basic ignition, gravity-feed carburetor. The transmission is straightforward. The suspension is leaf springs that rarely break. Most repairs are routine: replace a worn clutch, adjust brakes, fix a fuel line. Contrast that with a half-track or tank that requires specialized tools, complex procedures, and hours of labor. The D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944, brought 1,000 jeeps ashore on Normandy beaches in the first 24 hours. The vehicles were critical for establishing command and control in the chaotic initial phase. Commanders drove jeeps between scattered units, coordinating actions and identifying priorities. Communication teams established radio links. Medical units evacuated wounded from beaches to aid stations. The mobility allowed American forces to organize resistance faster than German forces could concentrate counterattacks. German defenders in Normandy encountered the jeep in roles they hadn't anticipated. Jeeps towing 57mm anti-tank guns appeared on flanks German commanders thought secure. Jeep-mounted machine guns provided suppressive fire during infantry assaults. Jeep ambulances evacuated wounded under fire, maintaining American units' combat effectiveness. The versatility forced German tactical planners to account for threats appearing from unexpected directions. Lieutenant Kurt Meyer, a company commander in the 352nd Infantry Division defending Omaha Beach, described post-battle observations. "The Americans have mechanized everything. Their commanders drive to the sound of guns in small vehicles. Their soldiers are supplied by vehicles that seem to go anywhere. Their wounded are evacuated in the same vehicles. This mobility gives them tempo we cannot match. We move on foot or horse, they drive." The breakout from Normandy in late July 1944, Operation Cobra, showcased mobile warfare at scales unprecedented in military history. American armored divisions, supported by motorized infantry and supplies delivered by thousands of trucks and jeeps, advanced 30 to 40 miles per day across France. The German army, lacking equivalent mobility, couldn't establish stable defensive lines. American forces simply drove around strongpoints, bypassing resistance that would have stopped traditional forces. The Jeep's role in this operational mobility was providing tactical mobility at the point of contact. While tanks and trucks moved along roads, Jeeps operated across the entire battlefield. Reconnaissance Jeeps scouted routes. Command Jeeps positioned leaders at critical points. Supply Jeeps delivered fuel and ammunition. Medical Jeeps evacuated casualties. The Jeep enabled the tempo that German forces couldn't match. General Lieutenant Franz von Funk, commander of XLI Panzer Corps, described the operational impact in post-war interviews. "American mobility was decisive. Their units moved faster, concentrated more rapidly, and sustained operations longer than we could. The mobility wasn't just tanks, it was their entire force structure. Every soldier, every supply crate, every piece of equipment moved by vehicle. We moved on foot, by horse, or waited for inadequate motor transport. The speed differential made it impossible to establish defenses before they arrived." The intelligence value of captured American equipment became apparent as German forces recovered damaged or abandoned jeeps. Technical intelligence teams examined the vehicles thoroughly, producing detailed reports on design, construction, and capabilities. The reports revealed German engineers' grudging respect for the Jeep's engineering efficiency. A March 1944 German intelligence report on captured American equipment included this assessment. The American Jeep light reconnaissance vehicle demonstrates efficient design philosophy optimized for mass production and field reliability. The vehicle's mechanical simplicity ensures high operational readiness with minimal maintenance. The four-wheel drive system provides mobility exceeding heavier German vehicles. The vehicle's utility is enhanced by standardized mounting points allowing roll adaptation. production volume indicates American industrial capacity significantly exceeds previous estimates. Recommend German development of comparable vehicle, though resource constraints prevent implementation. The recommendation for German equivalent came too late. Germany did develop the Volkswagen Kübelwagen, a lighter, simpler vehicle intended for similar roles. The Kübelwagen was effective in many scenarios and actually superior to the Jeep in some respects. But Germany produced only 50,000 Kübelwagens during the entire war, less than 10% of American Jeep production. The industrial capacity gap meant that even when Germany developed competitive equipment, it couldn't produce sufficient quantities to matter strategically. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 demonstrated the Jeep's value in defensive operations. When German forces attacked through the Ardennes, American units scattered across a wide front used Jeeps to maintain communications, coordinate withdrawals, and establish new defensive positions. The mobility allowed isolated units to escape encirclement. Command Jeeps positioned leaders where they could organize resistance. Supply Jeeps brought ammunition forward to units running low. The winter conditions, snow, ice, and sub-zero temperatures tested the Jeep's cold weather reliability. The simple mechanics proved advantageous. Engines started relatively easily because they had minimal components to freeze. The vehicle could be push-started if batteries were dead. The manual transmission worked even when lubricants thickened. The mechanical fuel pump operated regardless of temperature. Jeeps continued functioning when more sophisticated vehicles failed. Sergeant Thomas Price, a squad leader in the 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne, described the Jeep's role. "We were surrounded, outnumbered, and running out of supplies. The Jeeps kept us fighting. They brought ammunition when we were down to our last magazines. They evacuated wounded to aid stations. They let commanders move around the perimeter to direct defenses. Without those Jeeps, we couldn't have held." The Rhine crossing in March 1945 required moving massive forces across a major river obstacle while under fire. Engineers built bridges under German artillery fire. Infantry crossed in assault boats and amphibious vehicles. Once a beachhead was established, the priority was getting vehicles across to exploit the crossing. Jeeps were among the first vehicles prioritized because they provided disproportionate combat power for their size. The mobility they enabled allowed American forces to expand beachheads faster than German forces could contain them. Reconnaissance Jeeps identified weak points in German defenses. Command Jeeps positioned leaders to direct attacks. Supply Jeeps brought ammunition forward. By the time German reserves arrived to counterattack, American forces had expanded the beachhead beyond containment. The final months of the war in Europe saw American forces advancing on multiple axes simultaneously across Germany. The operational tempo was possible only because of the mobility infrastructure. Armies moved hundreds of miles per week, supplied by truck convoys, but given tactical flexibility by Jeeps that could reach any unit anywhere. German forces lacking equivalent mobility couldn't concentrate forces effectively because they couldn't move fast enough. General Major Karl Wagener, Chief of Staff for 5th Panzer Corps, reflected in post-war interviews. American mobility was decisive. Their units moved faster, concentrated more rapidly, and sustained operations longer than we could. The mobility wasn't just tanks, it was their entire force structure. Every soldier, every supply crate, every piece of equipment moved by vehicle. We moved on foot, by horse, or waited for inadequate motor transport. The speed differential made it impossible to establish defenses before they arrived. In the Pacific Theater, the Jeep faced entirely different challenges. The jungle terrain, tropical climate, and island warfare conditions tested the vehicle in ways European combat never did. The Jeep proved adaptable to Pacific conditions, though it required modifications. The jungle terrain was the most significant challenge. Narrow trails, dense vegetation, and soft ground limited mobility. The Jeep's narrow track width allowed it to use trails that wider vehicles couldn't navigate. The high ground clearance prevented the chassis from dragging on roots and rocks. The four-wheel drive system provided traction in mud that stopped two-wheel drive vehicles. The tropical climate caused problems the desert never presented. High humidity promoted rust and electrical corrosion. Constant moisture degraded leather and rubber components. Fungal growth contaminated fuel and oil. The Jeep's simple mechanics helped. Fewer electrical components meant less to corrode. Basic fuel system meant less contamination impact. Simple cooling system meant fewer leak points. The island warfare presented unique logistics challenges. Every vehicle, part, and gallon of fuel had to be shipped across thousands of miles of ocean. The Jeep's fuel efficiency and low maintenance requirements made it the most logistics-friendly vehicle available. A Jeep could operate for weeks on the fuel supply that a tank consumed in days. Marine Corps and Army units in the Pacific used Jeeps extensively for reconnaissance, command, supply, and medical evacuation. The vehicle's ability to operate on beaches, soft sand that stopped trucks, made it invaluable for amphibious operations. Jeeps could drive off landing craft, cross beaches, and operate inland, while other vehicles waited for engineers to improve routes. Major General Holland Smith, commander of V Amphibious Corps, described the Jeep's specific role. "The Jeep is our most versatile vehicle. It goes anywhere Marines go. It carries supplies, evacuates wounded, mounts machine guns for fire support, and provides command vehicles for officers directing operations. We could fight without tanks. We've done it before. We can't fight effectively without Jeeps." The Jeep's use as weapon platform reached its apex in the Pacific. Armed Jeeps mounting .5 caliber machine guns, 37mm guns, or even 75mm recoilless rifles provided mobile fire support for infantry operations. The vehicle could position quickly, deliver fires, and displace before receiving counterfire. This mobility made Jeep weapons platforms more survivable than static defensive positions. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was noted in captured documents and post-war interrogations. Japanese tactical doctrine emphasized infantry infiltration and close combat, where American firepower advantages were minimized. The Jeep's mobility disrupted these tactics by allowing American forces to reposition rapidly, respond to infiltration, and maintain cohesive defenses. Japanese forces couldn't isolate American units that maintained mobility through Jeep transportation. The China-Burma-India theater presented perhaps the most challenging conditions any military vehicle faced. The terrain ranged from Himalayan mountains to Burmese jungle to Chinese rivers. The infrastructure was primitive or non-existent. Supply lines stretched thousands of miles through hostile territory. The Jeep proved indispensable in this environment. The Burma Road, the supply route from India to China, required vehicles capable of negotiating mountain roads carved from cliff sides, river fords, and jungle trails. Trucks made the journey, but Jeeps provided flexibility that bulk transport couldn't match. Critical supplies, priority personnel, and time-sensitive items moved by Jeep faster than convoy schedules allowed. General Joseph Stilwell, commander of American forces in the CBI theater, regularly traveled by Jeep across terrain that tested the vehicle's capabilities to their limits. His Jeep journeys, often hundreds of miles across hostile territory, demonstrated both the vehicle's reliability and the commander's confidence in it. Stilwell's willingness to travel by Jeep influenced subordinates' use of the vehicle for forward leadership. Merrill's Marauders, the special operations unit operating behind Japanese lines in Burma, relied on Jeeps for supply and evacuation despite operating in jungle terrain where vehicles seemed impossible. The unit established airstrips in jungle clearings where transport aircraft delivered supplies and evacuated wounded. Jeeps moved supplies from airstrips to forward units, operating on trails cut specifically for them. The mobility advantage over foot movement was decisive in maintaining operational tempo. The post-war impact of the Jeep extended far beyond military applications. Soldiers returning from the war remembered the vehicle's capabilities and wanted civilian equivalents. Willis Overland began producing civilian Jeeps in 1945, establishing a market that continues today. The vehicle that won the war became an American cultural icon, symbolizing adventure, capability, and freedom. The military impact was even more significant. Every army that observed the Jeep's performance developed equivalents. The Soviet Gaz-69, British Land Rover, French Delahaye VLR, and Japanese Toyota Land Cruiser all traced their design philosophy to the American Jeep. The concept of lightweight, four-wheel drive, general-purpose military vehicle became universal doctrine. The U.S. military continued using Jeeps long after the war. The M30, M38A1, and M151 variants served through Korea, Vietnam, and into the 1980s. The design evolved. The M151 used independent suspension instead of leaf springs, aluminum body instead of steel, and more powerful engine, but the basic concept remained unchanged. The Jeep's eventual replacement, the HMMWV, Humvee, was significantly larger and heavier, but followed the same conceptual philosophy: maximize mobility and versatility through simple, reliable design. The production statistics captured the Jeep's unprecedented scale. The 640,000 vehicles built during World War II represented more four-wheel drive vehicles than had been produced in all previous history combined. The production rate, up to 1,000 per day at peak, was unmatched by any other vehicle in any nation's inventory. The cost efficiency, producing complex four-wheel drive vehicles at prices comparable to civilian automobiles, demonstrated American industrial sophistication. The reliability statistics were equally impressive. U.S. Army maintenance records showed Jeeps required an average of one major repair per 15,000 miles, exceptional reliability for military vehicles operating under combat conditions. The operational readiness rate, 90% plus, exceeded any other vehicle class. The simplicity that critics dismissed as primitive proved to be genius when measured by the only metrics that mattered. Did it work? Could it be fixed? Would it be available when needed? The strategic impact was measured in mobility enabled. American forces in Europe moved an average of 5 to 10 miles per day during offensive operations, fast by historical standards, glacial by American World War II standards. The rapid movement was possible because commanders could position forces quickly, supplies could reach forward units promptly, and wounded could be evacuated rapidly. The Jeep didn't make this possible alone. Trucks, trains, and ships moved the bulk tonnage. But the Jeep provided the tactical mobility that translated strategic movement into operational success. The German recognition of the Jeep's significance came too late to matter. By 1944, German intelligence assessments acknowledged that American mobility advantages were decisive. German forces couldn't match American movement rates. German logistics couldn't support equivalent operational tempo. German tactical doctrine couldn't counter an enemy that appeared everywhere simultaneously because their reconnaissance, command, and supply vehicles could traverse terrain German forces considered impassable. The captured German documents revealed this transformation. A February 1945 Wehrmacht training directive titled Combating American Motorized Forces contained this assessment: American tactical mobility exceeds German capabilities across all vehicle classes. Their light reconnaissance vehicle, Jeep, provides mobility approaching tracked vehicle performance with significantly lower logistical burden. Units encountering American forces must assume enemy reconnaissance can observe any position accessible to infantry, and that American commanders can appear personally at critical points within minutes. The mobility differential has become a decisive combat multiplier that German forces cannot effectively counter with available resources. The admission was remarkable. 3 years earlier, German intelligence had dismissed the Jeep as an unarmored toy. Now, with Germany collapsing under Allied offensives, Wehrmacht doctrine acknowledged that this simple vehicle represented a capability gap that couldn't be closed. The psychological impact on German soldiers was equally significant. They understood they were fighting an enemy who could move faster, respond quicker, and sustain operations longer than they could. The post-war interrogations of senior German commanders revealed consistent themes. When asked what Allied capabilities most surprised them, mobility was frequently mentioned. Not the mobility of tanks or aircraft, those were expected from industrialized powers, but the pervasive mobility at every level, down to individual squads equipped with vehicles that could go anywhere infantry could walk. Generalfeldmarschall Albert Kesselring, commander of German forces in Italy and later the Western Front, provided this assessment during interrogation in 1945. The Americans mechanized warfare more thoroughly than we understood possible. We thought mechanization meant tanks, armored cars, and trucks. The Americans mechanized everything: reconnaissance, command, supply, medical evacuation, and communications. Their small general-purpose vehicle appeared in roles we never anticipated vehicles could fill. This created tempo advantages we couldn't match. Our infantry walked, theirs drove. Our supplies moved by horse cart, theirs by vehicle. Our commanders received reports by runner, theirs drove to observe personally. The cumulative effect was decisive. The industrial comparison highlighted American advantages that went beyond any individual weapon system. Germany produced approximately 350,000 military trucks during the entire war. Impressive by pre-war standards, inadequate compared to American production of 2.4 million trucks, plus 640,000 Jeeps. The quantitative advantage meant American forces had 8 to 10 times more vehicles per soldier than German forces. This translated into mobility that German forces simply couldn't match. The fuel consumption comparison was equally stark. The Jeep's 15 to 20 miles per gallon meant it consumed approximately 0.05 to 0.06 gallons per mile. A typical German military truck consumed 0.15 to 0.2 gallons per mile, 3 times more fuel for comparable cargo capacity. Across hundreds of thousands of vehicles operating thousands of miles, this efficiency translated into millions of gallons of fuel saved. Fuel that could be used for tanks, aircraft, or simply to extend operational ranges. The maintenance burden comparison showed similar advantages. A Jeep required approximately 2 man-hours of maintenance per 100 miles of operation. German military trucks required 5 to 8 man-hours per 100 miles. The difference meant American maintenance units could support 3 times as many vehicle miles with the same personnel. This allowed American forces to sustain higher operational tempo without overwhelming their maintenance infrastructure. The versatility factor multiplied these advantages. A German military truck was primarily a cargo vehicle. It moved supplies reasonably well, but couldn't perform reconnaissance, command, medical evacuation, or weapons platform roles effectively. A Jeep could perform any of these roles with minimal modification. This meant American forces needed fewer vehicle types, simpler logistics chains, and less specialized maintenance, all of which improved operational efficiency. The armor protection issue, or rather, the Jeep's complete lack of armor, was the primary criticism of the vehicle during and after the war. The Jeep provided zero protection against small arms fire, artillery fragments, or mines. Crews were completely exposed to enemy fire. In environments with significant direct fire threats, the Jeep's vulnerability caused casualties that armored vehicles would have prevented. But the armor debate missed the strategic point. The Jeep wasn't designed to survive direct fire. It was designed to avoid direct fire through mobility and small size. The vehicle's role was reconnaissance, command, and supply in areas where direct fire was unlikely or could be evaded. In these roles, the Jeep's speed and agility provided better protection than armor. When direct fire was likely, heavier vehicles were used. The Jeep filled niches that armored vehicles couldn't fill efficiently. The casualty analysis supported this approach. U.S. Army casualty records showed that Jeep-related combat deaths were proportionately lower than casualties in other vehicle types relative to usage rates. Soldiers in Jeeps were more likely to survive ambushes than soldiers in trucks because the Jeep could accelerate away faster and maneuver more aggressively. The lack of armor was offset by mobility that kept crews out of situations where armor would be needed. The mine threat was more serious. Anti-tank mines would destroy any wheeled vehicle, and the Jeep's light construction meant that even anti-personnel mines could cause casualties. Mine warfare became increasingly prevalent as Germany shifted to defensive operations in 1944-1945. American forces adapted by using mine-resistant vehicles for routes known to be mined and accepting casualties when Jeeps hit unexpected mines in cross-country movement. The cold calculation was that losing occasional Jeeps and crews to mines was acceptable when weighed against the mobility advantages the vehicle provided. This sounds callous, but military operations always involve risk-benefit analysis. The Jeep's contribution to winning the war justified the casualties incurred using it. The alternative, restricting movement to avoid mine risks, would have prolonged the war and caused far more casualties overall. The Soviet Union received approximately 50,000 Jeeps through Lend-Lease, along with hundreds of thousands of American trucks. Soviet forces, which had minimal motorization in 1941, became significantly more mobile by 1944, partly through American vehicle deliveries. The Jeep's impact on Soviet operations was documented in Red Army after-action reports that noted increased reconnaissance effectiveness, improved command responsiveness, and better supply distribution to forward units. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the most successful Soviet commander of the war, acknowledged American vehicle contributions in his memoirs. "The Americans provided us with vehicles that significantly improved our mobility. Their light reconnaissance vehicle, we called it Willis from the manufacturer name, gave our commanders and reconnaissance units capabilities we had lacked. The vehicle's cross-country performance was excellent, better than our domestically produced vehicles. It operated reliably in conditions that stopped our trucks. Without American vehicles, we could not have conducted operations at the scale and tempo we achieved in 1944-1945. The British Commonwealth forces used Jeeps extensively, particularly in North Africa, Italy, and Northwest Europe. British forces initially preferred their own light vehicles, the Austin Champ and various armored cars, but increasingly adopted Jeeps for roles requiring maximum mobility with minimal logistics burden. Commonwealth forces particularly valued the Jeep for special operations, with the SAS and Long Range Desert Group using armed Jeeps for raids behind Axis lines. The French forces of the interior, after liberation in 1944, were re-equipped with American vehicles including thousands of Jeeps. The mobility these vehicles provided allowed French forces to contribute meaningfully to Allied operations, despite having minimal indigenous military production. French mechanized divisions operating in southern France and later Germany relied on American vehicles for their mobility. The Jeep's symbolic importance grew as the war progressed. The vehicle appeared in war bond posters, newsreels, and propaganda photos. It became visual shorthand for American military power, a symbol that average citizens could understand more easily than tanks or bombers. The Jeep represented democracy's capacity to mobilize industrial resources for war, to produce simple solutions that worked reliably, and to provide ordinary soldiers with extraordinary capabilities. The cultural impact in America was significant. Before the war, four-wheel drive vehicles were specialized equipment used primarily for agriculture or forestry. The Jeep demonstrated that four-wheel drive capability could be packaged affordably and used broadly. This created market demand that reshaped the automotive industry. By the 1950s, civilian Jeeps were recreational vehicles. By the 1970s, four-wheel drive SUVs were becoming mainstream. Today, four-wheel drive capability is common across vehicle classes, a transformation that began with the Willys MB Jeep. The military doctrine impact was equally lasting. The Jeep established that military forces needed lightweight, general-purpose vehicles optimized for mobility, rather than specialized vehicles optimized for specific roles. This philosophy influenced post-war vehicle development across global militaries. The concept of a Jeep-like vehicle, lightweight, four-wheel drive, air-transportable, multi-role, became a standard requirement in military vehicle procurement. The technological influence extended to civilian automotive engineering. The Jeep's simplified four-wheel drive system made the technology accessible to mass production. Previous four-wheel drive systems had been complex, expensive, and unreliable. The Jeep proved that rugged simplicity was more valuable than sophisticated complexity. This lesson influenced automotive design philosophy across the industry, not just in four-wheel drive systems, but in approaching engineering challenges generally. The manufacturing innovation, modular construction, standardized components, simplified assembly, influenced post-war industrial practices. The Jeep demonstrated that complex products could be built rapidly without sacrificing quality if design prioritized manufacturability. Henry Ford's assembly line had shown how to build one product efficiently. The Jeep program showed how to build a sophisticated product efficiently under wartime pressure. The lessons learned influenced American manufacturing across industries. The cost-effectiveness analysis conducted after the war showed remarkable return on investment. The entire Jeep program, development, tooling, and production of 640,000 vehicles, cost approximately $415 million. This represented roughly $650 per vehicle, including all program costs. Compare this to a Sherman tank at $50,000, a B-17 bomber at $200,000, or an aircraft carrier at $70 million. The Jeep provided disproportionate military value relative to its cost. The force multiplication effect was harder to quantify, but clearly significant. How many additional miles did American armies advance because commanders could reach forward units in Jeeps? How many lives were saved because wounded reached medical care in Jeep ambulances? How many attacks succeeded because reconnaissance Jeeps identified enemy weak points? These questions don't have precise answers, but the directional impact is clear. The Jeep enabled capabilities that would have been impossible without it. The German attempt to develop equivalent capabilities came far too late. In 1943, the Wehrmacht requested development of a lightweight general-purpose vehicle with four-wheel drive and cross-country capability comparable to the American Jeep. The Steer Company produced prototypes of the Type 1500A, a competent vehicle that met requirements. But German industrial capacity, already strained by tank, aircraft, and munitions production, couldn't support large-scale production. Only a few hundred were built before the war ended. The Kübelwagen, Germany's primary light vehicle, was simpler than the Jeep. Rear-wheel drive only, no four-wheel drive system, lighter construction. It was adequate for many roles and actually superior to the Jeep in some desert conditions due to lighter weight and better sand traction. But the Kübelwagen couldn't match the Jeep's climbing ability, mud performance, or load capacity. More critically, Germany produced 50,000 Kübelwagens compared to 640,000 Jeeps. The quantitative difference was strategically decisive regardless of qualitative comparisons. The final German assessment of the Jeep came in a May 1945 Wehrmacht Technical Intelligence Report titled American Military Equipment, Final Evaluation. The section on the Jeep concluded, "The American Jeep represents optimized design philosophy for military utility vehicle. The vehicle demonstrates that sophisticated engineering is not always superior to robust simplicity. The Jeep's mechanical simplicity ensures high reliability and ease of maintenance. The four-wheel drive system provides mobility exceeding many tracked vehicles in cross-country conditions. The standardized design allows mass production at costs, making the vehicle nearly expendable. American industrial capacity to produce such vehicles in quantities exceeding 600,000 units demonstrates material superiority that German industry cannot match. The Jeep's contribution to American military effectiveness exceeds its apparent capabilities. It is the enabling system that makes American tactical mobility possible." Germany's failure to develop equivalent capability earlier in the war represents significant strategic mistake. The admission was a fitting epitaph for German pre-war assumptions. In 1940, German military analysts had dismissed American industrial capacity as irrelevant. Quality would defeat quantity. Experienced troops would defeat inexperienced recruits. Sophisticated weapons would defeat simple ones. The Jeep disproved all these assumptions. American industry produced overwhelming quantity without sacrificing quality. American troops equipped with vehicles that went anywhere became more mobile than German veterans. Simple, reliable design proved superior to sophisticated complexity in actual combat conditions. The human stories behind the statistics brought the Jeep's impact into focus. Technical Sergeant Audie Murphy, America's most decorated soldier, credited a Jeep-mounted .50 caliber machine gun for his Medal of Honor action. When German infantry and tanks attacked his position, he climbed onto a burning tank destroyer and used its machine gun to hold off the attack. Lieutenant Audie Murphy's subsequent actions were enabled by the firepower and mobility Jeeps provided to his unit. Private First Class Desmond Doss, the conscientious objector who received the Medal of Honor for saving 75 wounded soldiers at Okinawa, used a Jeep ambulance to evacuate many of the wounded once he brought them down from the escarpment where the fighting occurred. The Jeep's ability to reach the base of the cliff and quickly evacuate casualties to aid stations saved lives that would have been lost if evacuation required carrying wounded on stretchers. General George S. Patton's famous drive across France in 1944 was enabled by the mobility infrastructure that included tens of thousands of Jeeps. Patton's command Jeep, with its three-star flag flying, became an iconic image of American aggressive leadership. Patton's willingness to visit forward units personally, driving his Jeep at reckless speeds, inspired subordinates and influenced battles through personal leadership at critical moments. President Eisenhower, reflecting on the war in his memoir, Crusade in Europe, identified the weapons that won the war: the Dakota aircraft, the Higgins landing craft, and the Jeep. This assessment from the Supreme Commander was telling. He didn't choose the B-17 bomber, Sherman tank, or battleship. He chose three relatively simple systems that enabled operations by providing transportation, logistics, and mobility. The Jeep's inclusion in this list captured its strategic importance. The final production statistics documented unprecedented manufacturing achievement. Total Jeeps produced: 640,000, 363,000 Willys MB, 277,000 Ford GPW. Peak production rate 1,000 per day. Total production time 49 months, 1941 to 1945. Average cost per unit $648.53, $1945. Man-hours per vehicle 16 hours. Components per vehicle, 65,000 parts. Weight, 2,450 pounds empty, 3,250 pounds loaded. Engine, Willys Go Devil, 134 cubic inches, 60 horsepower. Fuel capacity, 15 gallons. Range, 240 to 300 miles. Top speed, 65 miles per hour, road, 45 miles per hour, cross-country. Climbing ability, 60% grade, 31 degrees. Fording depth, 18 inches, 27 inches with preparation. Towing capacity, 1,000 pounds. Operational readiness, 90% plus. Maintenance required, 2 man-hours per 100 miles. Major repair interval, 15,000 miles average. Service life, 50,000 miles plus. These specifications captured engineering philosophy that prioritized reliability, maintainability, and versatility over maximum performance in any single category. The Jeep wasn't the fastest, most powerful, or most capable vehicle in its class category, but it was the most useful because it worked everywhere, always, regardless of conditions, and there were 640,000 of them. The comparison to German light vehicle production highlighted the industrial disparity. American Jeep production, 640,000. German Kübelwagen production, 50,000, ratio 12.8 to 1. This 13 to 1 advantage in just one vehicle category illustrated broader industrial dominance. When multiplied across trucks, tanks, aircraft, ships, weapons, and ammunition, the industrial advantage became insurmountable. Germany couldn't win a war of attrition against an enemy who produced everything in such overwhelming quantities. The post-war Jeep industry, spawned by military experience, demonstrated the Jeep's lasting impact. Willys Overland sold over 70,000 civilian Jeeps in 1946 alone, more vehicles than many manufacturers sold across entire product lines. The CJ series, civilian Jeep, established the recreational four-wheel drive market that continues today. The Jeep became an American cultural icon that transcended its military origins. The military Jeep's service life extended decades beyond World War II. The M38, 1950 to 1952, served in Korea. The M38A1, 1952 to 1971, served in Korea, Vietnam, and Cold War deployments. The M151, 1959 to 1982, served in Vietnam and remained in service into the 1980s. Even after replacement by the HMMWWW, military Jeeps continued service in reserves and Allied forces. Some World War II-era Jeeps remained in military service into the 1990s, a testament to the design's durability. The international legacy was equally significant. Over 50 countries operated Jeeps in their military forces. Many developed domestic variants: the British Land Rover, Japanese Toyota Land Cruiser, Soviet UAZ 469, French Hotchkiss M201, Indian Mahindra CJ, all traced design lineage to the American Jeep. The vehicle that won World War II became the template for military light vehicles globally. The final irony was that the Jeep's greatest strength, simplicity, had been its initial perceived weakness. German intelligence in 1942 had dismissed the vehicle as primitive, unsuited for modern warfare, a product of American industrial inexperience. By 1945, German commanders recognized that the Jeep's simplicity was genius. It worked when sophisticated vehicles failed, it could be repaired when complex machines couldn't, and it was produced in quantities that made it effectively disposable. The transformation of German opinion from mockery to respect mirrored their broader recognition that American industrial philosophy, emphasizing reliable mass production over sophisticated limited production, was superior in total war. Germany had produced technically advanced weapons that were impressive in small numbers but couldn't be manufactured in decisive quantities. America had produced simple weapons that worked reliably and existed in overwhelming numbers. The war proved which approach was more effective. General Oberst Heinz Guderian, the father of German armored warfare doctrine, reflected on this in post-war writings. The Americans defeated us not through better weapons, but through more weapons produced more efficiently. Their Jeep exemplified this approach, a simple vehicle that any factory could build, any mechanic could repair, and any soldier could drive. We produced sophisticated vehicles that required specialized factories, trained mechanics, and experienced drivers. When our sophisticated vehicles broke down or were destroyed, we couldn't replace them fast enough. The Americans simply built more Jeeps. Industrial warfare requires industrial solutions. We failed to understand this until too late. The Jeep story was the story of American industrial mobilization in microcosm. A requirement issued in June 1940 was fulfilled by September 1940. Production began in 1941 and reached 1,000 units per day by 1943. By 1945, there were more Jeeps than there were German military vehicles of all types. The speed, scale, and efficiency of this achievement demonstrated industrial capacity that no other nation could match. The vehicle Hitler had mocked in 1942, the unarmored toy automobile, became the weapon that drove circles around his army. Not through superior armor or firepower, but through mobility that German forces couldn't match. The Jeep went places German vehicles couldn't reach. It operated when German vehicles broke down. It was available in numbers German logistics couldn't dream of providing. It enabled tactics German commanders couldn't counter. In the end, the Jeep's legacy wasn't measured in kills or victories, but in capabilities enabled. How many commanders reached critical points because they drove instead of walked? How many wounded survived because Jeep ambulances evacuated them in minutes? How many attacks succeeded because reconnaissance Jeeps identified enemy weaknesses? How many supplies reached forward units because Jeeps could drive where trucks couldn't? These questions lack precise answers, but the directional impact is undeniable. The Jeep didn't win World War II. Brave soldiers, brilliant commanders, and overwhelming resources won the war. But the Jeep made winning faster, less costly, and more decisive by providing mobility that multiplied every other capability. It was the enabling weapon that made everything else more effective. The Germans had laughed at the simple American vehicle in 1942. By 1945, no one was laughing. The Jeep had driven circles around the Wehrmacht, outmaneuvering German forces across Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. The vehicle that looked like a toy proved to be one of history's most effective military innovations, not through sophistication, but through the simple genius of going anywhere, carrying anything, and working always. The final testament came not from American sources, but from the enemy who had underestimated it. In the ruins of Berlin in May 1945, Soviet forces discovered a German Wehrmacht training manual titled Recognition Guide Allied Equipment. The entry for the American Jeep, updated as late as March 1945, contained this assessment. The American Light Reconnaissance Vehicle, Jeep, represents the most ubiquitous Allied vehicle. Expect to encounter this vehicle in all combat situations: reconnaissance, command, supply, medical evacuation, and weapons platform roles. The vehicle's four-wheel drive allows cross-country mobility approaching tracked vehicle performance. Units should assume American forces can reach any position accessible to infantry. The Jeep's small size and agility make it difficult to engage effectively with anti-tank weapons. Anti-personnel weapons and mines are most effective countermeasures. Note, American replacement rates suggest destroyed vehicles will be replaced within 48 hours. Destroying individual Jeeps has minimal operational impact due to overwhelming American production capacity. The admission captured everything. The vehicle Germans had dismissed as a toy had forced them to revise tactical doctrine, accept that American mobility couldn't be countered, and acknowledge that destroying individual Jeeps was pointless because there were always more. The simple vehicle had become unstoppable not through invulnerability but through ubiquity. Hitler had mocked the Jeep. Then it drove circles around his army, his doctrine, his assumptions, and ultimately his entire war effort. The laughter died somewhere in the North African desert when German commanders realized they were facing an enemy that could go anywhere, appear everywhere, and sustain operations indefinitely. By then, it was too late. There were 640,000 Jeeps, and they were everywhere, driving toward Berlin.